Good afternoon, everybody, and a very warm welcome on what's turned out to be a freezing cold spring day in Brussels to this European Ombudsman event. It's called Guarding the Guardians, the Survival of Independent Public Administrations in Volatile and Polarised Times. And this is part of a series of events and activities that the European Ombudsman is organizing in this year of elections throughout 2024 to highlight the importance of independent public administrations as one of the cornerstones of a healthy democracy. Now, this of course is an evergreen issue, but we also think that it's rather timely with the European elections just around the corner and all the changes to personnel and administration that will happen in the aftermath of those elections. And the rhetoric is heating up. Some of you will have seen a recent speech by Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban, where he said, and I'm going to quote, "We need to go deeper, occupy positions, gather allies, and fix the European Union. It's not enough to be angry. We need to take over Brussels." So whatever about the rhetoric, I think this suggests that concerns about safeguarding the independence of the EU administration are not merely hypothetical. I think it's fair to say that we might expect at some point in the near future that there might be, how shall I put it, determined efforts to make sure that certain ideological standpoints are represented within the EU administration. So we will be talking more about that with the excellent panel that we have now lined up for you. But let me first make a few housekeeping points just before I invite the European Ombudsman to give her opening remarks. So this event is also being streamed, and we have many participants who are joining us online. For those who are online, please know that the recording will be published on our website later. We are, of course, an inclusive and participatory organization, so you can join in the conversation on social media with the hashtag EODebate. That's hashtag EODebate. And for those of you watching online on WebEx, you can also send in questions. You can also join in the conversation that we're going to be having here in the room. And you will be able to see in the bottom right-hand corner, there's a Q&A button for those of you who want to ask questions. But before calling up the Ombudsman to make her introductory remarks, we thought we would like to make this event, these themes, a bit more tangible, give you some examples of some of the sharp rhetoric that we've seen in recent years about public administrations and the relationship to politics. So we have a short video that we have composed just to get things going and just to make it all a little bit more concrete for you. So now that's going to run, and my thanks to our colleagues in communications.
The independence of public administration is essential for healthy democracies. 10 years ago, the stability of the democratic institutions in the UK and US was largely unquestioned, but recent events have challenged any complacency. In the US, the idea that civil servants are ideological opponents has become orthodoxy among some politicians.
Here's my plan to dismantle the deep state and reclaim our democracy from Washington corruption once and for all, and corruption it is. First, I will immediately reissue my 2020 executive order restoring the president's authority to remove rogue bureaucrats, and I will wield that power very aggressively.
In the UK, civil servants have consistently come under attack for undermining the Brexit process and government.
I suggest we listen to them and not the overpaid pen pushers in Whitehall who are not doing a neutral job, and once Brexit's done, we'll take the knife to them, all right? Had enough of all of it. Had enough of all of it.
Well, I think you'll agree, some very chilling examples there. And so now it is my great pleasure and privilege to invite the European Ombudsman, Emily O'Reilly, to give the opening address. Thank you, Emily.
Thank you very much, Carl, and welcome everybody. And Commissioner, welcome. The room was so calm before that clip, I almost feel I have to apologise for it, but I suppose it really does give us the flavour of what we can be up against. So good afternoon, and you're very welcome to our discussion here this afternoon. So the topic, as you know, essentially concerns the way in which public administrations, and by extension the public, can be protected from the populist impulse to undermine anything that gets in the way of a government intent on implementing the will of the people, be it the media, the courts, the regulators, or the civil service itself. Academic and other writing on this topic acknowledge the issue, and at the heart of much of the writing is an exploration of what an independent public administration is, or more specifically, what are the limits of civil service obedience to the demands of any government, populist or otherwise. There is, of course, no singular will of the people, but neither probably does there exist a civil service that is resolutely neutral and with no internal will or ambition of its own. The tension between what is being called the permanent government and the government of the day exists and has always existed, even in the most liberal of democracies. That tension expresses itself in the space between the civil service obligation to implement the legislative agenda of an elected government and the civil service at times ambivalence or critically perceived ambivalence towards that agenda or parts of it. We saw that narrative played out in Brexit, and we also saw it played out during former British Prime Minister Liz Truss's attempt to implement budgetary measures that ultimately led to her downfall, a downfall blamed by Truss on the wokenomics of the deep state. The failure to date of Brexit to realise all that was promised by its champions is similarly blamed by some British politicians, as well as Brexit ideologues such as Nigel Farage, on the so-called faceless bureaucrats actively seeking to undermine it. The Hungarian Prime Minister, Viktor Orbán, routinely targets Brussels bureaucrats, an unaccountable elite, as he depicts them, who must be face down, a well-worn trope, and not just in Hungary. Having exerted control over many of the checks and balances of power in his own country, through media, electoral, and other legislation, his ambitions have grown. Throughout the democratic world, governments choose different balances as between civil servants appointed through merit-based procedures and with security of tenure, and short-term political appointees also there to advise them. It is undoubtedly true that tensions arise at times between the political appointees and the officials. The question for today is, at what point do those normal and healthy tensions become abnormal and unhealthy? Or at what point do officials become so undermined, ignored, or outnumbered that a threat is posed to democratic norms and to the rule of law? Governments can rightly say that if they have been legitimately elected on a specific agenda, then they have the right and the duty to implement that agenda with the support of their civil service. If those policy choices are ultimately found to be flawed, then it is the political system, either Parliament or the next election cycle, or sometimes the judicial system, that has the right to take care of that, and not interference before that point by the civil service. Again, that is a view probably broadly accepted in most democracies. Where problems arise is when a government seeks to change the civil and political rights of its citizens through changes to its judicial system, for example, through discriminatory treatment of minorities, the control of media, restricting civil society organizations, the plethora of ways in which the populist playbook tends to be played out. Problems, of course, also arise when what the government is saying simply isn't true. So in those instances, how does the public administration prevent itself from being weaponized? And even in advance of that, how can a public or civil service be developed and maintained in a way that gives it strength when governments or political leaders seek to attach it to its populist machine? So again, you're all very welcome. Thank you for participating, and I hand back to Carl. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Emily. Thank you, Emily. And we will now remove the podium so you have a better look at, you can have a better view of our next guest. And the title of our event is about politically polarized times, and I don't think there have been much more polarized times than the Brexit debate of recent years. And I'm delighted to have with me Lord Darroch talk a little bit about the UK experience of how to maintain an independent public administration in very, very volatile and politically polarized environments. So, Lord Darragh, you have had a very long and distinguished career of 40 years in the UK Foreign Service. And you've had a number of prestigious postings, including you were the permanent representation here in Brussels. You were also the UK ambassador to Washington. But actually, your own family background is a rather humble one. Your grandfather, I understand, was a miner from County Durham, and you yourself grew up in a council house just outside of Oxford. And so, in a sense, your story, your career story, is one of a genuinely meritocratic civil service in the Foreign Office. Is that how you experienced it?
First of all, thank you for the invitation here. It really is great to be here. Brussels is one of our favourite cities, so I seize every opportunity to come back, and this is a really good excuse to come back. So thank you. Yeah, do you know when I took the civil service exams, in which you take the same exams as people going to the Treasury or the Ministry of Defence or wherever, with a few tweaks somewhere down the process if you want to specialise in foreign policy. Maybe naively, I had no doubt that it was a completely fair and open process, and you know, the dice were not stacked against me. Anyone with a university degree could apply. I actually did my civil service exams while I was at university up in Durham, down in Oxford, surrounded by Oxford University students. I didn't go into the exams thinking, well, I have no chance, surrounded by all these people. I remember in the written exam, one of the questions was invitation to write a kind of submission for ministers on how you would address a huge problem facing the country. And the one that the exam paper I did was about a global pandemic that was going to kill a lot of people and take a lot of other people out of the workplace, and how would you cope with that? I remember concocting an answer thinking, this could never happen. But anyway, I got through the exam somehow, and from the first day in the Foreign Office, no one ever asked me about my background or what school I'd gone to or university, anything like that. So it never even occurred to me that there might be any sort of unusualness about my background. The one thing people did ask me was when they found out I had done zoology at university, and these were all politics or arts or modern languages graduates, almost to a man, apart from one other friend of mine, still a friend, who was a theoretical physicist. Basically, we were two scientists amongst a lake of art students. And throughout my career, when people discovered this, the world was divided between two groups: those who thought this was a really strange background, a really strange subject for a diplomat to have done, and those who thought zoology was the most perfect preparation for diplomacy.
So zooming forward now, 40 odd years or so, that reputation that the UK had for being the gold standard of a meritocratic independent civil service has taken, in the famous words of a Norwegian football commentator, one hell of a beating. And so for you, what are the key incidents over the last few years that are telling of this general decline?
First, Carl, I have to say this has been really painful to watch. And I left the Foreign Office and left the Civil Service in 2019, and I've seen the last 5 years, and I've seen what a hammering our reputation, both as a country and as a civil service government, has taken. And, you know, it really hurts, because we always used to pride ourselves on our skill as negotiators, our knowledge of the world, our diplomacy, all of this stuff, and that reputation has really gone down. If I look at what the reasons for it were, I mean, we'll come on to talking about Brexit, and Brexit has certainly accelerated the decline. The first thing I remember is maybe 20 years ago, maybe 30 years ago, a decision was taken, a reform was introduced under which not just ministers, who were the only people who would appear before parliamentary committees before that, but also civil servants could appear before parliamentary committees. And once you reached senior levels of the civil service, inevitably, whichever branch you were in, you were summoned by the various parliamentary committees, and the TV cameras were there, and these were public events. So prior to that, civil servants, I mean, the cabinet secretary, could walk down a street in central London, no one would ever recognize him. And suddenly these people became public faces, public figures, written about in the media, sometimes ridiculed in the media or criticized for the weakness of their presentations before committees and so on. So that changed the nature of being a civil servant. But if you go beyond that, then the real acceleration in our problems, in our damage to our reputation, I think came post-Brexit, and it came, it was an extraordinarily difficult time for the government, and they were finding it very difficult to find the right policies post-Brexit. But the phenomenon that really sticks in my mind is permanent secretaries started getting fired. And 5 friends of mine, Mark Sedwill, who was Cabinet Secretary, Philip Rutnam, who was Permanent Secretary in the Home Office, Simon MacDonald, Permanent Secretary in the Foreign Office, and Tom Scholar, Permanent Secretary in the Treasury, a bit later under the Truss administration, all got fired. And I don't remember any Permanent Secretary being fired for the first kind of 35 years of my career, and suddenly this happens. And it wasn't ever even claimed that this was about failures to do their jobs properly. It was about them not being completely, in the accusations of ministers, and these arguments were made publicly, that they weren't completely signed up to the agenda that the government was trying to implement, which in translation means they were giving independent and objective advice about the validity and viability of some of the policies that were being proposed.
So they were fired for doing their jobs, essentially.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, if one of the ministers who was doing the firing was here, he would argue differently, but that's how it looked, and it looked like that across the civil service, because, of course, you know who your permanent secretary is, and a great deal of respect, almost always, for the way they're doing the job. And so that has a chilling effect across the whole civil service institution. Add to that a great deal, and I mean, there has been a real crescendo of it in the last few years of this administration. I mean, successive prime ministers, changing prime ministers a lot, but the turn of some ministers have been really outwardly, deeply, profoundly critical of the civil service. And so it really sticks, because I don't blame the media for reporting it all. I mean, if ministers are going to say that about the civil servants, it is news and it is a story. And it culminates, of course, with Liz Truss's book. I mean, this happens to be the week, by coincidence, when Liz Truss's book, 10 Years to Save the West, is published. And the whole book, I've only read the reviews of the book, is basically an attack on the deep state, civil service, not just the civil service, but also the media, the BBC especially, the Financial Times, slightly weirdly, and a few other parts of it. The judiciary are accused basically of a conspiracy to thwart her government's objectives and aims. I mean, she did sack Tom Scholar, the Secretary of State and the Permanent Secretary of the Treasury. I would just one last point. The 2 flaws in this argument about the deep state are these. If you look at Brexit, civil servants might have advised against the form of hard Brexit that we took. So this was going to be the most damaging form. They didn't stop it. We went down the hard Brexit route. Similarly, Treasury officials might have advised against Liz Truss's kind of radical and revolutionary budget. They didn't stop it, still got announced, and then the markets basically crashed the British economy. So if there is a deep state, it's profoundly ineffective.
And what general lessons can be drawn from this? I mean, we talked about Brexit earlier. I mean, is this something that is uniquely a result of Brexit, do you think? I mean, if Brexit hadn't happened, would we have seen this?
I track the real problems we've had in Western democracies back to the 2008 financial crisis. And I don't think there is a government in the West that has had an easy time since then. And if I look at the UK, we've basically had pretty much no economic growth. I mean, very, very weak economic growth at best since 2008. We had the years of austerity, which have done huge damage. I mean, I was part of those policies, so it had to be done because we had doubled our debt. But it's done a lot of damage to our public services across the board: health service, education, local government, and so on. And people, for reasons I can understand, things are not getting better every year. They're not getting more money every year. Their lives are not improving every year, and they've kind of lost faith in mainstream governments in Western countries. And populism has grown, and I think Brexit was a symptom of what people felt about what their governments had delivered, what the British government had delivered between 2008 and when the referendum happened, and about austerity and all of that. I think the election of Donald Trump in the States was a reflection in the way of how people had felt about the way America had been since 2008. So I track a lot of it back to then, but there's no question that Brexit accelerated the rift between politicians and civil service in the UK. And as I say, actually the politicians got the kind of Brexit they'd wanted, but there was a lot of criticism and firings in the civil service post that period.
And so looking forward now, there will be a general election in the UK later this year. Very likely there will be a new government from later in this year onwards. How do you fix this? Because that's the real issue now. I mean, this sort of general slide is something that we see all around the world. What advice would you give to an incoming, presumably Labour government? We don't know. That's what the polls are indicating. But what advice would you give to a new government now?
Yeah, I mean, I think first of all you have to attune them to reality, which is they're going to have, I think, the most difficult inheritance of any incoming government in my lifetime. If you compare it with the last great changing of the guard in 1997, when the Blair government took over from after 3 election victories by Margaret Thatcher and 1 by John Major, and by the way, that Labour government, which I worked for, came in very suspicious of the civil service, believing that it had become irredeemably, children of Margaret Thatcher and Thatcherized, and found actually that it was a civil service that was really desperate for change and for new leadership, and worked very successfully with the civil service through its time. But if it is a Labour government, and the polls certainly point that way this year, they will have nothing like as good an inheritance as the 97 government did, because, to put it very simply and very bluntly, there is no money. And I think whoever wins the next British election is going to have to, one way or another, get more money into the public services. And whether they do that by cutting expenditure or by raising taxes or both, that's going to be the reality. And unless we can restore economic growth at something like pre-2008 levels, even raising taxes is not going to bring enough in to do what is needed for the health service, for education, for all the areas which are really suffering at the moment. So it's going to be very hard for any government coming in to live up to the promises they're bound to make during election campaigns. So
do you think the conflict could intensify, in fact, between the civil
service?
I don't
think so, because I think to try and address the problems that need addressing, and they're legion, you can't do it without basically getting the civil service on side and supporting you in the reform efforts you make. And you can do some things by efficiency and by some quite radical changes that I think that we need, for which you absolutely need the civil service on side. So I don't worry about that particularly. I think that we're going back to an area where ministers or politicians, civil servants, are going to have to work closely together, and where all of this sniping that's been going on has to stop. But I do think it's going to be very hard to deliver, and I think you will have voices from the opposition that will continue to blame the deep state for problems. So I don't think the problem or the criticism goes away, but I would be surprised if it was from the next government in the UK. I mean, we haven't had it, to be fair, we haven't had much of it from the current version of this Conservative government. I mean, Sunak works very well with civil servants. He was very popular in the Treasury. David Cameron works extremely well with civil servants. The Foreign Office is thrilled to have him in the job. So relations are much, much better at the moment. But the problems are huge.
Yeah, but this rhetoric about the deep state, this divisive rhetoric, you think that's here to stay. So that's in a sense an inheritance from the U.S. Truss's rhetoric is an echo of what's happening in the U.S. You yourself are a very seasoned observer of U.S. politics. You were, of course, famously an ambassador to Washington, and I can recommend to everybody here Kim's book, Collateral Damage, on his experience more generally, but also that time.
Still available on Amazon.
Still available on Amazon. If you want to know more, and in a sense, you were yourself a victim of some of these issues. But we saw in the video what Trump has said and what he intends to do. I mean, how worried would you be if you were a federal employee in Washington right now about if Trump comes to power?
Yeah. Look, I think first thing to say, Carl, is let's be in no doubt Trump can win the election in November. He can get back into the White House. I'm not sure I would bet my house on it, to be honest. I think there's a long, long way to go. And boy, does he have some obstacles on his path there. One of them has just started, as we've all noticed from that courthouse in the States. But it's possible. And some would say on the basis of opinion polls, which I think it's far too early, too much backing into the opinion polls, but they suggest at the moment he's going to win. So it's quite possible. Now, second point, there is no doubt that in his first term, there were those whom he appointed who were actually working to slow down or thwart his agenda, because some of them have gone public on it and have said they were there to basically protect America from Donald Trump. So his criticisms of the deep state, he would say they had some validity. Look at what all these people are saying in the media. Although, frankly, if you were there in Washington watching it, there were many reasons why he didn't get much of his agenda through, and people inside the system working to slow them down or thwart them was only a small part of the picture, and the incompetence with which some of these goals were pursued was a bigger reason for not delivering. But if you look at Trump 2024, everyone, I assume, all heard about Schedule F, the idea that he would sweep away, not merely, I mean, when you change from Republican to Democrat or vice versa in America, kind of the top 1,200 jobs in the administration change. And that's, so it is quite politicized already, the American Civil Service. He wants to change the top 50,000. He wants to go 3 or 4 ranks down into the American administration and put his own people in. He wants to strip away employment rights so that they can all be ones who are there. If they are blocking his agenda, or he believes they might block his agenda, they can be fired without the normal protections. And an organization called the Heritage Foundation, this is all publicly out there, is running a thing called Project 2025, which is about finding sufficient loyalists, and being loyal is the first requirement of their vetting process, to fill those jobs. So this is real, and I have no doubt that if he wins, he will try to implement this. And he will put absolutely trusted people who've been with him for a long time into the cabinet level jobs, and he will try and change 3 or 4 layers below that. And he might succeed, though in America what always happens is you get court challenges and the whole thing will get slowed down. So it's not a given that he will succeed, but there is no question about his intention. But it is different from those of us in Europe who have an objective, completely apolitical civil service, because it's already, as I say, at the top level politicized, but it's changing it all the way down the system.
You said that Boris Johnson would like the UK's civil service.
Yeah, I mean, I think Boris has been, I think he's gone public on this. He certainly would say in private that he quite admired the American system and that he felt that he was being thwarted in some of his Brexit-related objectives by the civil service. Didn't like some of the advice he was getting and would have liked a more Americanized system. Not 50,000, I think. I think he wanted the permanent secretaries and maybe the layer below that to be political. But yeah, he was, I don't know if he still is, but he certainly was when he was in government. He never did anything to actually deliver it, but apart from people were being fired.
Like a lot of Johnson initiatives, of course.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, Kim, thank you very much for that bracing opening, and that set us up very, very nicely for the next section. We were tempted to title this segment "A Warning from History," because I think a lot of people, had a lot of admiration and high regard for the UK civil service, and I think it's amazing, and you've just instanced it now, just how quickly things can deteriorate. But we're going to bring the conversation back home to Europe, and we're going to talk a little bit now about could it happen here? Could it happen here in the EU administration? Could it happen here in Europe? So I would like to invite our other distinguished panelists to come here. I'm going to ask Kim to stay where he is, and he will also contribute to the conversation. But if I could ask the Commissioner, delighted to see the Commissioner here, Commissioner Hahn, Commissioner for Budget and Administration, and then we have Professor Elena Mungiu-Pipidi, who is Professor of Comparative Policy at Lewis in Rome. And last but not least, of course, we have our own European Ombudsman, Emily O'Reilly. So we're going to have a few brisk round of questions for everybody, and then we'll go to the audience very quickly, because I'm sure you have many questions that you want to ask as well of all our panelists. But I'm going to start with you, Alina, because you have made it your life's work to study some of these issues around the independence of public administrations as a bulwark against anti-corruption, for example. And the evidence tells us that it's a very mixed picture between meritocratic systems and systems which are essentially ones of political patronage. Is that correct?
Well, thank you for the question, and absolutely for the invitation, Carl. Since you told me not to bring any surveys and show no charts, I will have to narrate the continent by myself. So I think that the basic first thing that comes out of the studies is that there is no European standard into independence of civil service from politics, what we call autonomy of the state from private interest. For sure, if we put an advertising kit out there, it's not going to be the film Borgen to present as the European standard, because that's not it. It's not going to be yes minister either, right? If I put this to my students, they don't even understand, many of them from many European countries, what is this about? What are these situations even picturing? Because governance is really very diverse in Europe. Okay, so this being said, I would say that Europe divides between older democracies and newer democracies. Older democracies, in particularly those who built their bureaucracies in a top-down way, by an enlightened despotism way, which is the classic way actually in which bureaucracies got built. Monarchs prompted bureaucracies against their unruly aristocrats in order to extract better taxes and control the societies. And these are the countries like Denmark. These are the Borgen kind of countries, which until today in surveys, we do not have a regular yearly survey to establish this, but we have the Evans and Rowe from the World Bank. We have some studies in Europe. We have a couple of expert surveys. So we do have surveys in which we look at this. And the difference is still there. So these are the countries which have the best bureaucracies. And maybe it's interesting to mention in this context that all over the world, the quality of bureaucracy is not increasing, with the exception of a couple of, could we call it enlightened despotisms, with limitations, which are Qatar and United Arab Emirates. There are no bureaucracies in the past 10, 15 years where quality of bureaucracy and its independence from the political factor has increased. Then there are the old democracies, countries like France, which achieved it democratically, but it took far longer while. And like United States, that is actually the example for new democracies, because these are countries which had first elections, and after elections, they had to build a democratic apparatus. And this takes tens of years, because once you have parties, parties will colonize the administration. This is what parties do if it's a young state, more or less. And this is normal, okay? And we know that countries can grow out of it eventually. That's not something that populists brought about. And then, unfortunately, there are, young democracies which they joined the European Union, and where the fact of really reshuffling seriously the civil service after each election is a fact of life. We have studies from 24 European countries, and we have regular studies in East European countries, but it's not just East European countries, I mean, you can see this phenomena actually spreading. I'll just give two radical examples. A few years ago, it's been a trial in Belgium, in Wallonia, in which two people for the first time, two very innocent looking people, members of a political party, were judged for having received income as part of boards of some state-owned enterprise here in Brussels, right, in which they had been for a year appointed by their political party without never going. By the way, they had absolutely no competence. It was for some sort of technological company, and they were, one of them a lute professor and the other one a sportsman. And their defense was that why them? Because it is unusual appointment to make by political parties. Such appointments are in the gift, as we call, of political parties, appointments in the board of state-owned enterprises, and this is something that people do not talk about, but which exists in still a very large number of countries. The news was that for the first time these people were charged because some Belgian prosecutor decided that enough is enough, government is modern, we no longer do this. And they were complaining that why unlucky us in all this. Also in Italy, there was a scandal a few years ago because some people had been appointed, had actually bidded for public jobs as health controllers, not in the south of Italy, by the way, in Emilia-Romagna, one of traditionally well-governed provinces. And again, the defense was that this is generally health controller positions go through party network. If the party has the county, they will appoint these people, all right? What was really considered outrageous is that they put it to a bid and the higher bidder gets these positions. So I think that, in Europe, we do not really speak enough of what the situation really is. There are other areas like public broadcasting over which had always been an immoral wrangling of power, and whoever comes to government immediately changes the leadership of public broadcasting, okay? And this has been an old story. So in other words, first thing is first, it's a diversity of patterns in Europe, and we have had only a number of countries where we can say that there was a real benchmark, and we had a quality bureaucracy which had been independent and traditional. And second thing is that there is no convergence if you look in the data. I have a CUP book called The Europe's Burden, Promoting Good Governance Across Borders, where I looked systematically at countries like Italy and Greece, who are old European members, at more recent countries, trying to answer the question if countries which are in the European Union are affected and their governance improves, comes close to some goodness of fit, some standard. Now, as I told you that there is no standard, but still, nevertheless, you would expect that these countries would have improved. And these countries have not improved. Rather, what we hear is actually some of the old bastions of meritocracy in Europe are a little bit backsliding. So governance is a difficult thing to change. And merit, if a society is based on merit versus connections, is a fundamental fact of governance, which doesn't change from one day to another. And there's more work to do in this direction.
So the backsliding is not only a feature of Eastern European countries as it goes, it's also in mature democracies as well. Yes, yeah. But turning to you, Commissioner, next. Alina's given us a snapshot of how the picture is across the EU. With regards to your capacity as Commissioner in charge of human resources, how confident are you as to how robust the rules and procedures are to prevent this kind of subverting of the independence of the EU administration? And sorry, I should have mentioned this at the start, but if you could also speak up and clearly into the microphone so that those online can hear clearly as well. So just be aware of that. Thank you.
Well, I think European civil servants are highly protected by the staff regulations. So sometimes I would say even too much protected. And it's always to strike the right balance. And I think it's very much about personalities, characters on both sides. And but in general, I would say at the European level, there shouldn't be any concern. I mean, it's also based on the fact that if you take the commissioners, most of them are there for 5 years, and some of them are twice, very few, 3 times like myself, but usually civil servants can rely that they are coming and they are going. And then we have the concept of rotation, So I think, and we have a rather strict division between the public administration and the political level, which is, by the way, also very symbolically expressed by the fact that, different to all the other public administrations I know, commissioners are sitting together in the same building, whereas their general directorates are somewhere in the city. So different to traditional or normal public administrations where the ministers are sitting in the ministry, here in Brussels the commissioners are sitting not in the general directorates. And I wouldn't say this is a firewall, but it's somehow, I think, a clear division between the traditional work of the public administration and the final political level. Second, I think if you take European Commission, you know, we take all decisions collectively, formally, and it was once counted, I don't know how, but every day we take around 100 decisions as a European Commission. Usually, I suppose all these 100 decisions are taken by the public administration. Otherwise, we would not be able to deliver. So only a few decisions are finally taken by the political level in case it's highly politically. And in our case, I would say many of our decisions are leading to guidelines what has to be done. And of course, at the end of the day, there is a primacy of the political level. It has to steer, to guide certain developments, but then it's up to the public administration, to the civil servants, not only to implement, but in the preparation of something, to give a good advice. And it's finally up to the commissioners, to the ministers, to which extent they react, refer to what they receive. I think a certain problem is that if you look at the European political landscape, and probably this is not only a European phenomenon, the life expectation of ministers, not to speak about British prime ministers, is a very short one. It's a very short one. And so this also has an impact on the competence, on the way to steer processes, to work with people. Many of the politicians became minister without any expertise and experience how to run a big organization. And the ministry is a big organization. Many of them have never been in a position where they had to steer the work of a few people, not to speak about hundreds and thousands of people. And this is a problem where they very often believe they can overcome this problem by creating big cabinets with people which are even less experienced. Yeah? And then it creates tension with the public administration, with the civil servants. And this is, I don't have an answer to it, because
you're referring to national level.
It's mainly the national level, I have to say. This is a big advantage of the European level. We are just in this famous transitional year, which we have every 5 years, but in between, people can rely on stability and predictability in terms of people, in terms of intentions, etc. So it's something different, and I think here at the European level we're in a somehow privileged position, also in the interest of people. But if you look at the national level, the situation is a very different one.
The Commissioner, sorry, if I can just press you on that, because you talked about the staff regulations and the rules, but of course it's partly about culture as well, right? So there is a tendency sometimes for staff, permanent staff, to try and anticipate the political wishes of their political masters, or to orient themselves in advance. Do you see that as a problem, or just an inevitable tension?
Look, I think it's impossible, and thanks God it's impossible to capture all by regulations. uh, at the end of the day, it's about people and how people are working together. And it's about their characters. You cannot predict each and everything, and I think it would be a nightmare if you try to predict each and everything and try to regulate it in advance. It's about the way how people are working together. And I think, honestly, I cannot complain. I have to admit, also, if I take my personal experience, I am now for more than 20 years full-time politician. Before that, I was in business, and of course, like many people from the private sector, we had some sentiments about civil servants. But I have to admit, I have really changed my opinion. And again, I have experienced that many civil servants are very much dedicated, committed, are ready to work more than uh, the minimum working time. So I think again, it's about people. We cannot regulate each and everything. It's very much about the relationship between politicians and civil servants, and this also depends very much, to a certain extent, on the experience of politician once they are in an executive function.
So turning to you now, Ombudsman, you have often praised the very high standards of the European Commission and other EU administrations, and indeed handed out awards for these. But this issue of standards and rules versus culture, I mean, you've often also talked publicly about the importance of a particular culture. Would you like to say a little bit, elaborate on that a little?
Yeah, people sometimes, I was Ombudsman in Ireland for 10 years, an information commissioner before I became Ombudsman here, and people often say to me, what's the difference? And in some ways, it's pretty much the same. Somebody complains, you ask the relevant department or DG for their explanation in relation to it. You look at documents, you make up your mind whether there's maladministration or whether everything's fine. You make recommendations or suggestions or whatever. So that system and those procedures are basically the same. But where the difference is culture. And so when you're dealing with issues of ethics, revolving doors, conflicts of interests, lobbying, or you're dealing with access to documents. I don't deal specifically with data protection, but often data protection is used as a block to access to documents. That's where you find the real cultural shifts. So, for example, if you take something like revolving doors, in some countries you do have strong rules relating to it. In other countries, it's simply just part of the ether. It's what happens. You spend some time in government, you go into the private sector, you might come back again. And so then what standard is supposed to be applied at the European level? And that's where that's where some of the problems arise. Because, for example, we've done a lot of work specifically on revolving doors. And we often see it in specific instances and more generally as a sort of a form of soft corruption, really, when, civil servants who have been working on key regulatory files are hired by private companies, and the reason is very obvious. They're there to access their network and essentially to get inside information. I mean, you can call it what you like, but in some egregious instances, it is a form of soft corruption. So, we've been talking about this and doing a lot about this over the last number of years. And, sometimes we have some small successes, and there have been some steps, progressive steps in relation to the Commission. But it's really tough to do, because you come across a kind of a cultural resistance and the sense of, well, people are entitled to work and so on, and almost like a reluctance within the Commission, particularly because you are the big beast in the jungle, to either to recognize this as the problem it can be, or to stop people from doing something that they actually want to do. And that's where you get that cultural piece in relation to it. Then actually just an incident that happened, and you're talking about, political appointees, political advisors and civil servants and so on. A few weeks ago, I had a visit from the Commission's, the Petitions Committee from the German Parliament. and we were talking about our work and so on. And then one of the members looked at me and said, "So tell me, how are the political groupings represented in your office?" And the answer is they're not. Certainly, as far as I know, they're not. So there was this expectation that the EPP, the S&D, Renew, and all would also be reflected in the makeup of my office. And if that is the case, then there certainly is a deep state. But I mean, most of my colleagues have been, all my colleagues have been appointed through merit-based competitions and all of that. And on another level, when we are dealing with complaints and when there is a blockage, let's talk about the Commission, because you are our biggest client, because not because you're poor at administration, but because obviously most of the complaints are in relation to the executive body. So sometimes when a complaint that we're dealing with, or an access to document complaint that we're dealing with, is a little bit sensitive, well, not necessarily to us, but to the Commission, you never really know who's actually dealing with it. I mean, ostensibly it's the officials, but then you hear, well, this is blocked at cabinet level, or this is blocked at the political level. So it's very difficult for us to see how this has been sorted out and who is actually making the decisions. When we know, according to the rules, the civil servants do this, certainly in relation to Regulation 1049, which is the access to documents regulations. There are procedures and protocols that there's a law, in fact, that dictates how it should be dealt with and enacted. But very often we do very strongly sense that there are political decisions being made where they shouldn't be made.
Excellent. Alina, earlier you mentioned that it's a very heterogeneous picture, of course, but one of the standout features of what we saw in the UK and the US is how quickly things degrade. And I'm just wondering, is there anything in your research that tells us about how quickly this can happen and what we can do to stop it?
Well, this is what I would call sustainability, and this issue didn't exist 10 years ago. I mean, we took for granted when we have this color convention in governance indicators in which countries where a good equilibrium was reached, where societies are actually able to control and have a good public integrity, are in the green. Countries which are bad are in the red, and all the nuances in between, all the yellows and everything are from one part to another. And we sort of took it for granted that the green countries will be forever green, but now obviously this doesn't happen. When we were building these new integrity frameworks in post-communist Europe, I visited an institution in the United States which is called Office of Government Ethics, and which exists for every branch of government, very constitutionally designed, which is an extraordinarily modest institution in charge of checking the conflict of interest of all officials. Institution was created after Whitewater, didn't exist before, and every state has one, plus Congress has one, and the rest. And this is the institution that we used as a model to build this public integrity office in Moldova, which had meanwhile scaled up by European Commission in a variety of countries. 20 years ago, there were not such institutions in Europe, and there are still few, because in many countries, this kind of disclosures of interest don't exist yet. But now they have proliferated. So imagine a little bit, what did I feel when I had to explain to these politicians to whom I had sold this in quite a few countries, when Mr. Trump came to office, and the first thing, he sued the Office of Government Ethics. And then Jared Kushner also sued the Office of Government Ethics, because what they knew from their experience with taxes, where they hadn't paid taxes all their life, by being in court and disputing taxes, is that as long as the case is, you can say it's no conflict of interest. I mean, office says it is, I say it's not, so let's discuss it, and the entire mandate goes away. All right, but you could have known this, knowing Mr. Trump's behavior from tax. But, this was never very much part, when Trump had all this radical rhetoric against corruption, the fact that he himself was such a poor candidate to make this kind of speeches. He was a rich man who had never paid taxes, basically. And this was never a focus of the campaign against him. And I think this was a very, very big mistake. And in countries where we see this kind of backsliding, there usually are motives to criticize traditional parties. I mean, let's face it, let's not hide it. German Christian Democrats would still be in government if they wouldn't have had unaccountable members who sold sanitary masks at inflated crisis, and in my country we would have at least investigated them. But like this, they just went home after the public scandal and nothing happened, but they lost elections. So the public has a reason to be a bit upset about what is going on. But if we do not concentrate a little on who are the alternative, who are coming in, checking their own records, because in their own records they would be like Trump, they would be as vulnerable as Trump, and putting a little bit more effort of showing that they are in fact a danger to the judiciary and to the civil servant, then this is it will happen in more than one. In more than one country.
It's a rather pessimistic picture, right? Because what you're suggesting is there's not anything you can do to make these administrations invulnerable to that kind of political pressure. But turning to you, Commissioner, now, the European Commission and the administration has been on its own political journey over the last 10 years or so. There's been an understandable desire to increase the legitimacy of the European Commission by linking the composition of the college, for example, and the political orientation of the college more closely to the outcomes of the European Parliament elections. So this is the idea of a more political or geopolitical commission. Do you see any, from your standpoint as a member of the college and as a national politician in Austria, do you see any downsides to this kind of evolution?
First, honestly, the commission or the members of the commission were always a political commission. I mean, it was never labeled in the past. Then during Juncker it became a political commission, and now it's a geopolitical, and maybe the next one will be a galactic one, and then we start from beginning. But in reality, it's composed mainly of politicians in the past, mostly only politicians. So I don't see a big difference. But what I wanted to refer is to Madame O'Reilly is, I think we are entering an interesting phase, at least I would say at the European level, but potentially also in other public administrations. The idea that young people are interesting to work with us and then to stay till their pension with us is, I would say, fading away. Today, people are interesting to work because for their CV, it's quite interesting to work 5-10 years with the European Commission, then to do something else, etc. So the idea of the past, once you are in the Commission and then you are there for the rest of your professional life, this is no longer probably valid. And I suppose, but this is more for my successors, to reflect on this. Why I'm saying this? Because we are indeed very tough on our revolving door, so to say, rules, and for good reasons. But on the other hand, we have to see the downside of it could be that certain, maybe particular talented people might say, okay, if it's so difficult to move from my current civil service career to the private sector, it's maybe better not to do it and to do something else immediately. And I think we should have a strong interest to get the best talented people also in the civil servant, but at the same time not creating too many hurdles to move away from us. I think there's not one size fits all, but I'm sure that the current rather rigid system is not sustainable for the future. And this is something we have to understand. I mean, we are benefiting in Europe a lot at the European Union, that everybody who is working here in Brussels wanted to work here. It's very different. Maybe some Belgian people are working for the Commission more or less by chance, but all the others have decided to move to Brussels, and they are very committed to work here, be it public administrative people or be it even politicians. But the world is changing. The world of the business world or the professional world is changing, and we have to adapt to it.
Yeah.
Also in the way we adopt and we apply our rules.
So, I mean, to link the two issues, I mean, the one issue is about the revolving door into the private sector. The other is about the influence of politics on the administration. But I suppose the link is you know, if what your view is that perhaps the system might insulate permanent civil servants too much from other outside sources of pressure.
Honestly, I also don't like this. Sorry to say this expression, the influence of the political sector to the public administration. At the end of the day, it's about the political level to give guidelines, and in a good, let's say, healthy structure, there is a loyal implementation of it. A loyal implementation also in the way that, of course, civil servants have their opinion and should give their opinion. But at the end of the day, it's about the political level to take the decision. And this is, sorry to say, not something negative. They are elected by people. They are getting a mandate. They are based on their political programs, promises, whatsoever, and they try to implement what they has promised in a political campaign, in an electoral campaign. And of course, this is democracy. So it's not. It sounds always. It's very negative if politicians are influencing civil servants. No, they are there because they have been elected on the basis of announcement promises. I don't want to judge the quality or the content, but simply the fact that they are there, they are elected, they are the representatives of people, and they try, in a good way, hopefully, to implement what they have announced. And for this, of course, they need also the civil servants. Yes. And in a good, in a healthy structure, it's feasible to do it.
Well, indeed, this goes back to your remarks in your opening statement, Ombudsman, about the distinction between healthy tensions, as you said, and unhealthy tensions. And maybe you'd like to respond, maybe to the Commissioner's remarks. Yeah.
Well, just in relation to the revolving doors piece, I mean, I absolutely take your point. The days when people went into the civil service at the age of 18 and emerged at 65 are probably gone, and people will have lots of different careers. I have 5 adult children, and I fully expect them to have many careers over their lifetimes, with hopefully not too much of a gap between careers. But I think we're not talking, when we do our investigations and we deal with our complaints in relation to revolving doors cases, we're not talking about people freely leaving the public service and going into the private sector. That's not a problem. That's absolutely their free choice to do so. But we're talking about which bits of the private sector they're going into and which bits of the public sector, and particularly the Commission or other agencies or bodies that they've come from. And so if we take 2 particular cases that we dealt with over the last few years. One involved the European Banking Authority, which was set up after the great unhappiness of the financial crisis, and precisely to improve standards of financial regulation across the EU, and also to reinforce citizens' trust in the financial and banking system when it was absolutely on the floor. So the case that we dealt with was in relation to the then head of the EBA, who went to join the one of the biggest banking lobbying companies in Europe. And we said to them as plainly as this: if there was one job you should have forbidden, it was that one, because of the potential damage to trust, because of the possibility that people who are Eurosceptic or hostile to the EU will weaponize those instances in order to paint a very unfair narrative of the EU and of the EU administration. And the other one we dealt with was with the European Defence Agency, where its head went to join Airbus, which is one of the biggest contractors to that. Again, well, in my view, a clear conflict of interest and one damaging public trust. And you remember the whole brouhaha when former Commission President Barroso went to Goldman Sachs, and the damage that was done to that, which was extraordinary. And actually, the complaints we got, a lot of them were from civil servants from the Commission who felt outraged at this and felt that it damaged not just the Commission, but the EU project itself. And I well remember when Jean-Claude Juncker, who had taken over after Barroso, and he rose to give his what you call it, the State of the Union address, and it was just after the Barroso thing had happened, and we'd opened an investigation as a result of complaints, and Nigel Farage, who was still there, stood up. He was the head of his particular grouping, and he said, "Please pass on my congratulations to the former president on his new job." And that was an example of it. So, of course, we're not talking about people who go to the private sector. We did a big investigation a few years ago, looked at 100 files of commission officials who had left. Most of them, not all of them, had gone to the private sector, and those who did, there were, in a lot of cases, there weren't many issues. Some of them had gone into academia, some had gone into, NGO work or whatever it was that they did. So when we, find maladministration or are highly critical of that, it is only in egregious cases, such as the ones that so it's not. And then, we get the argument from the Commission, people are entitled to have jobs. Nobody's saying they don't. It's just in those particular instances when it's clear that damage is being done to trust, that's when we, issue the sort of recommendations that we do.
But in the case of Barroso, of course, you can say there's a lack of sensitivity, but he took this job after his cooling off period. So that would mean, in general, he should never have taken this job.
Well,
this is something, that's why the regulation is the one thing and personal decision is the other thing. So this is...
Yes, but the cooling off period was one that was decided by the Commission itself, based on article, one of my colleagues is going to tell me what article it is in the treaties, 265 or whatever, which...
At that time it was 2 years. Now it is for Commission President 3 years.
Yes, exactly, which was a recognition that there was a problem before, that it was too short.
Yeah, sorry, I'm not defending Barroso, but in principle, after 2 years, what you are saying means that in general, he should never have taken this job. Maybe I wouldn't have taken this job, but to give people the space, the freedom to pursue a professional career after their political career should be a possibility.
So I'm sure there's a lot more that can be said about this topic. Probably we'll come back to it, I think, in the discussion. But I think...
I'll see you for a drink afterwards.
I think I'm very keen now to get in the members of the audience, both the audience here in person and online. So please, if you could just raise your hand, and there's a colleague of mine who's going around with a microphone. And when you ask your question, and it should be a question and not a comment, please, then please state your name and your affiliation, please. So one hand there at the back. Yeah.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Aurélien Mazui. I work for MEP Sarah Sanger, but I'm here on my personal behalf. I'd like to ask the question of this gray area, especially in the Commission, about the member of cabinets. And I think it's quite interesting moment, actually, where we are now at the end of the term, where we see a lot of movement from people in the cabinet being put as head of unit, director general, deputy director general, ambassador to somewhere, as a kind of lollipop for the services done in the cabinet, but not necessarily because they are the best person, just because they were in a cabinet, a political cabinet. And here, I think it's also quite problematic. Also, there was recently the case of Mr. Pieper, where clearly we saw that there was a political appointment of someone who was not ranked #1, but chosen to be the person. So I think as well here is an issue. And about the career in the administration, maybe also taking the problem of, well, people want to change, maybe ask yourself how we can retain people in the administration, because maybe the conditions are not what it used to be. Maybe there is no clear HR policy in the commission or institutions. Maybe this is also questions that one needs to ask himself, how to keep people in the institutions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I don't see another. I see one. Yes, one further hand here. The gentleman in the front. Yes. Yeah. If you could just wait for the microphone for the benefit of those online. Thank you.
Thank you. Coming here, I expected to hear much more about transparency and accountability, trust in the European institutions. We talked about everything, and I think we should differentiate between accountability, administration, and so on, the member states and the Commission. So the first thing would say there are elections, so I would like to know, are we happy with the accountability, transparency, trust of the institutions here? And they are very different. Do we say EU? Do we talk about the European Central Bank, or about the Council, or the Parliament, or the Commission? And that's a very different. I think administration, public administration in the member states, that is very national. And so the member states should change it if it isn't enough. It should be much better everywhere. But here we are especially, I hope, talking about the institutions. And Mr. Hahn, I don't think that it is as easy as you told us. We are elected and then we do the agenda. That's much more. You have the framework. Here we are not, it's the EU is not a state. You can do what is...
Sorry, your question is...
Written, yeah. What are your propositions about accountability, transparency?
With regard to this topic?
The Commission especially. Mr.
Okay.
Reilly, you could talk us about the Pfizer case. Is there enough transparency, or is it not enough?
Great.
It's a very interesting topic, but I heard nothing about that. So, thank you.
Thank you very much. And I will take one online question just to complete the trio, and then we'll go back to our panel. Thank you.
Yeah.
Honor, please.
Yes, so can you hear, is the mic on? Yes. Yeah, so we have some questions from online, so I'll just take one as you suggest. And that is, notwithstanding the EU staff regulations, is there really no risk that what happened in the US or what happened in the UK to the administration could not happen to the EU administration?
Okay, well, I think there's a couple of questions that are very clearly within your remit, Commissioner. There was a question specifically about cabinet officials who are then, who receive jobs within the administration. Would you like to take that and any other questions?
First, sorry to say this, first question was quasi saying that members of cabinet are not capable. And this is something I have to rebuff. I mean, members in the cabinet are highly capable, otherwise they wouldn't have been chosen. And therefore, I believe members in the cabinet also have the right to make a career like all the others. And it's not that all members of a cabinet becoming director, general director, and so on. Many of them are moving back to their previous posts. So this is not something. Second, I have to admit, it should not be a disadvantage to become member of a cabinet and potentially to work maybe more than others. And that's why it should neither be a particular advantage nor a particular disadvantage. And by the way, on the case of Mr. Pieper, I'm wondering how you know that there was a ranking. There was never a ranking. Otherwise, it doesn't make sense to take a decision finally based on a full assessment. But the story is done. He declined for different reasons, which I don't want to discuss here now. The last point, also to the second question, I mean, all of us, I mean, I'm talking now about commissioners, have to present their program in a hearing in the European Parliament. A hearing which is unprecedented compared to what I know, at least in Europe, to national, for national governments, national ministers. It's made comparable to the hearings in the US, in the Senate, because also there it is ahead of an appointment. Also here, it's ahead of an appointment. And we have to present our ideas, our programs, and based on this, we are finally judged. And therefore, we have a program which we have to implement. together with our other colleagues. So it's not that we are not legitimated, quite the opposite. We have been grilled. We have been grilled based on, so to say, our future responsibilities, our ideas related to this dossier, and therefore, of course, we have the obligation to implement it finally. Otherwise, we would be criticized by the European Parliament and others for failing on this. What was the last question from the online? Well,
Honorary, so if you could just repeat the question.
Yes, the question was whether there's really no risk of what's happening in the UK, or what happened in the UK, or what happens in the US happening to the EU administration.
I think I can say there's no risk.
Well, that might be a good point to bring in Lord Darroch again, actually, because you were here for 4 years as permanent representative. I think you know the EU administration quite well. Are these comparisons fair? What's your sense of the transparency, accountability of the EU administration from your time here?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that struck me listening to this discussion is instantly I recognize some of the issues that have been raised from my own experience in the British civil service. For example, the question about whether people in cabinets get favored in the promotion stakes and getting the best jobs. The Foreign Office that I joined, the golden route to the best jobs in future was to be a private secretary or assistant private secretary to a minister. We had 4 or 5 of them in Foreign Office, and those jobs were highly sought after. And yes, I got one of them at one stage. And it was believed around the Foreign Office that if you got one of those jobs, then your future promotion was assured and you'd get the best jobs faster. And if you didn't, then you might be not ignored, but you would sit in the backwater and your career wouldn't prosper. So it's very similar. And what they did in response to a lot of unhappiness around the Foreign Office was say, okay, we'll have open bidding for all jobs. Everyone has the right to bid for any job, and everyone has the right to get an interview for the job, and then the interview will decide who gets it. They also said, by the way, to ministers, you have no part in this process. You cannot lobby for your former private secretary to get to be ambassador in Denmark or whatever. Nothing to do with you. It'll be a completely separate, independent process. And if he or she is the best candidate, then they'll get it. But you're not going to get to be able to have any role in determining who gets it. And you still can't stop ministers from saying to the head of personnel, this guy is really good, or this woman is really good, you should think of them for this job. But it did restore a certain amount of faith, I think, in the fairness of the system. Now, I don't know how much that reflects what happens here, but certainly it was a problem inside the Foreign Service, and it was to a certain extent solved by this. To the extent, by the way, because if you're a private secretary to a minister, it's really long hours, it can be quite a lot of travel, you're never out of the office, you sometimes have to come at weekends. People stopped wanting the jobs, they didn't think anymore it was a really golden route to success. The other thing that struck me was hearing about people leaving and whether they should be entitled to take on certain jobs or not. Well, I've been through this because we have a system under which when you retire from government service, the Foreign Office or any other government departments, you have 2 years, if you're in a senior position, when you're not allowed to do anything without explicit permission for it. And this is really rigorous. And I remember I was offered a sort of 4-month fellowship at Harvard, for which I was paid precisely nothing but free accommodation. I still had to get permission for that. And they pondered it and they eventually said, okay, you're allowed to go. And other things, if I'd applied to do them, things that I'm now doing 5 years out, I would certainly have had permission refused. So it's quite a rigorous system, but it still doesn't always satisfy the media or the public out there, because I think of a recent example where someone left a job in Number 10 and went to work for a Gulf government. And this attracted quite a lot of criticism because this was thought to be somehow, it shouldn't have been allowed because this was, it's a government with which we have very good relations, but even so, going to work for a foreign government was not seen, although it wasn't stopped by the rules, it wasn't seen as right. So it's a very complicated area. My own, the last point, my own experience of working with actually all the institutions here, but particularly the Commission over 2 different postings and about 6 years in total, was the Commission is an exceptionally high quality organization. It is a bit more bureaucratic and a bit more layered and a bit more process than certainly the British government I worked for most of my career, and things need to be checked at more levels, whatever. And that's either a good thing or it slows things down, hugely depending on your viewpoint. But it was, we never had any trouble in finding out what was going on. We never had any trouble in getting explanations, getting to see people to find out what they thought. It might be difficult if different if you're a third country, but from where we sat, the Commission was extremely transparent and extremely accessible. Very high quality people, the best and the brightest. Say, sometimes idealism seemed to us to outweigh pragmatism in some of the decisions taken.
Very British perspective, I think.
Everyone would say that, but I have nothing but praise for our relations with the Commission. And by the way, the decisions that were reached, which is why Brexit is so hugely frustrating. I mean, the reality of British exceptionalism, whether from our policy on staying out of the euro or our policy of staying out of Schengen, we had so many exceptions made for us that we have nothing to complain about at all.
And so one of the questions raised the key question that we wanted to answer in this session, which was, could what we saw in the US and the UK happen here in the EU administration? And the Commissioner gave very clear, very robust answer to that, which is zero risk. And so I'd invite the Ombudsman and Elena, maybe from your perspective, different perspectives, is that how you see it as well, zero risk?
Well, I think the Commissioner is right that there are some institutional guarantees to prevent it, but then on the other hand, we are all bracing for quite a significant number of bad people entering European Parliament. And now let's face it, there are quite already a number of bad people in the European Parliament. There are people who take money from Azerbaijan, filmed himself promoting the guy with the theft of $1 billion Ilan Shore and something like this openly. All right, so the European Parliament, after the last scandal, has undertaken some reforms, but the fundamental thing, which is to set aside those who really are bad guys and who should not return there, did not happen. And this, of course, to answer this gentleman, did not increase public trust. I have seen a Sevipov poll, which is about to be published in just 4 countries, France, Germany, Italy, Spain. And in France and Germany in particular, the trust in the European Parliament is far lower than you would expect and far lower than in Eurobarometer. Now in Eurobarometer it is abnormally high. It's like nothing happened, nobody ever heard of it, which makes me believe that probably our colleagues in Sciences Po had got it right, and this is a warning, right? Now how could we do something like this? I think that in Europe it is this extraordinary reliance on regulation. Although we have evidence, people like us in this Horizon Bridge Gap, what do we do is that we look at regulation. Is EU regulation, really implemented? George Soros famously said that after Brexit, EU thinks it can solve the situation, giving directives and directives like somebody would really implement them. All right, and if I look at what I look at European Public Procurement Directive, all the patterns have been negative after this was adopted, and it's not a bad directive, it's a good directive. It's just not implemented. It's only Croatia of all Europe which has a little bit of progress. All the other countries also helped by the pandemic, okay, let's say, but everyone in particular is in European countries, Malta, Cyprus, Greece, it's really looking very, very bad. So we should not think of that we will fix this with more regulation. Can we have something like, someone to come and police integrity who is from top? Exceptional institution. Yes, theoretically this is an option. Let's create a very strong ombudsman, not a weak ombudsman as we have, In Chile, why was Chile the only country in Latin America in the green for 30 years? The only country, all the rest had governance problems. Because they had created in the 30s this extraordinary institution of a general controller who is in the same time an ombudsman, a judicial reviewer, a general auditor, and can go to court, so can actually prosecute, and which vetoes the entire regulation for integrity. They don't look in the contents of regulation. And this is why only one controller historically was fired by General Pinochet, because he had to sign the plebiscite approving the general and he did not. And this person is not elected for 5 years. It's elected by 7 or by life. For many years, they elected them by life. Many died in the office. All right, and you should see their palace or something. I mean, there are strong institutions which can change countries removed from this. But is this realistic? No. And then we are down to the last thing, which I think we should, I would like to see it for this European Parliament elections, but it doesn't look like it is materializing. I mean, what I think we need at the European level, where we were very shy compared to our countries, where we fought corruption and political corruption for many years, and therefore we have developed tools in even very difficult situations. What Europe would need would the kind of coalitions for clean parliament that we did in some countries. In mine was very successful. In Ukraine, it was replicated as Chesno. It was also a very big thing. I mean, game changers, where you blacklist candidates for parliament according to integrity criteria, and you take it directly to their constituencies so that people know before if they never pay taxes, if they are in the habit of threatening judges and whatever they're doing. And I know people vote by values, but I really think no European voter would like to have somebody paid by Qatar or Azerbaijan. That is not on the voters' agenda. So if we would do a little bit of a better job of tracing response, and that's a civil society thing, I mean, that, and the media thing. Media always helps in this. So, if Europeans want to protect their excellence in governance, we must fight these guys. We cannot just say because they profit out of corruption, and someone has to stop them.
It's the political supply side, you're saying. So the idea of an ombudsman for life is an intriguing one. And I don't know how we feel about that. But I would like, we are coming close.
Just concentrate on that, Carl.
We're coming up to time, but I think we might have time just for maybe one last question. Yes, the gentleman there in the front. Again, if you could state your name and affiliation, please.
Thank you. Federico Rossi. I'm a civil servant serving the European Economic and Social Committee. I have a quick question. Could you identify 3 areas in which an administration should invest today to maintain its neutral competency, especially in volatile and polarized times like the present times? So 3 areas in which we as administration should invest today to maintain our neutral competency. Thank you.
Very good. So we'll end with some positive prescriptions. You're allowed just 1. You don't have to have 3, but 3 is also good. So who would like to? Commissioner, what would you, from your experience?
Well, I think a big one, and we try to address this, is to offer civil servants, in particular in the European Union, the opportunity to go, for instance, to national administrations, like we offer the opportunity and we use the opportunity to have national experts in the Commission or in other European institutions, so that there is an exchange of experience and to see, so to say, the other side of the table and to experience how work in the national administration works, and on the other hand, that people from the national administration gain an insight how we are working and what are our considerations and so on. And the second is to invest even more in what I would call lifelong learning, and also in a more targeted development of human resources, depending on the needs, but also the specific interests of our colleagues.
Anyone else? I mean, I think we've. Give me yeah.
Just very quickly, I would say, if I interpret the question correctly, 3 things that, if I were saying this is how you run an accountable and transparent and proper organization, you need to focus heavily on, have a really effective ombudsman who looks at these things on 3 things. Number 1, appointments, how you make them, and who has power over them, and for what reasons people get appointed. Second, how you spend money, particularly on contracts which you're giving out to the to the private sector and how those decisions are taken and whether they're taken appropriately. And third, which is one of the few things I agree with Dominic Cummings about, you need people with special skills in administrations. And, British civil service had a very high reputation, but we're mostly generalists. And you need people with all sorts of skills in IT, in understanding science, in understanding properly how education works, and in all of those areas. And so, actually having a proper system for bringing people with really specialist skills into the system would make government work so much better.
Great. And Alina, you've already said a strong ombudsman institution is very important to improve the quality of the politicians on the other side of the fence. Anything else you would add to that?
On the civil servants, I think it's very much depends on what area they are. I mean, what kind of service they do. There are areas which are very remote, but for the areas which are not remote, which deal with the public in one way or another, the digital device which I promote is a satisfaction app. Everybody with whom you are in contact should have one of those green to rose button asking how did your interaction with the agency of, I don't know, European water went today. Okay, and this would also be phrased in such a way so to allow hints if something was not all right, and be absolutely general. The moment when you get your customer number, you also get your evaluation up and you tap. And for the managers, it's quite a good indication of what works, what doesn't work, or at least how the public sees you.
And Emily, I think it's quite appropriate that we would end with you and on this positive note about what can be done. I mean, would you like to talk about what the ombudsman can do? What would be your main prescriptions?
Yeah, I mean, I think when I get a bit sort of cross with the Commission or with any of the agencies and bodies, it's just partly out of my my belief in what a force for good the EU is and the EU administration is. And I've said before, sometimes like if you've children, it's the brightest and the best one that you get the crosses with when they're acting up, because you expect so much more from them. And therefore, when sometimes there's a say backlash against me, but when there's a bit of aggro, shall we say, about cases that I've taken on or whatever, it's precisely, it comes from that wellspring of thinking very highly of the EU administration and wanting it to adhere to the standards that it has set for itself, and also that the treaties have set for it. And people would probably be surprised to know that we find maladministration in just about 4% of the cases of the complaints that we get. And in other cases where there may have been issues, we do our best to help the institutions and the agencies by making what we politely call suggestions to them as to how to improve. And again, and my colleagues are probably sick of me using this phrase, but an ombudsman's office works well and a public administration works well when everybody agrees to play the game. And the game is that I, as ombudsman, do my work independently, effectively, efficiently within the law, and that the Commission or whoever recognises the role of an independent ombudsman within the architecture of the public administration. And unless an ombudsman's decisions and recommendations, which are taken on behalf of the complainants, let's face it, the citizens, are egregiously wrong or illegal or whatever, they should be accepted, because when they are accepted, then the citizens are reassured that the Ombudsman's Office is respected, taken seriously, and so on. Very often I'm asked, would you like more powers? Would you like binding powers? And I say the day that an ombudsman, a European ombudsman, is given binding powers will be the day that the public administration, the European public administration, has failed. Because in my experience, 20 years now as ombudsman between Ireland and here, I find that in countries around the world where the rule of law is at its weakest, the ombudsman are given the strongest paper powers. And where the rule of law is weakest, there is the lowest number, the lowest percentage of recommendations accepted. And where the rule of law is strongest and where the Ombudsman is actually, relatively speaking, weak powers, you have an acceptance rate of up to 100%. We're at about 80, which sounds high, but I would hope in years to come that will be higher. And I think it's a bit like the canary in the mine. The Ombudsman sees where the problems are and warns people. Also, the canary sometimes dies in the process, which is a problem with that metaphor. But anyway, I shall use it, and there I will end.
Thank you very much, Ombudsman. And we're out of time now. I have at least 3 important takeaways from this discussion. The first is that happily there's zero risk of the independence of the Commission being undermined in the near future. Also that we need a strong Ombudsman for life. And thirdly, we need to work harder on the quality of our politicians. And I would suggest that all 3 of these propositions,
Can't you guess?
all 3 of these propositions might be tested after the elections in June. So maybe my suggestion is that we reconvene after the elections and see how this has all turned out. But in the meantime, I would like, if you could, in the usual manner, if you could show your appreciation for our excellent panel and for the excellent discussion we've had today, and a big round of applause for everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, and so just 2 more housekeeping announcements. So first of all, if you would like to continue on this conversation on revolving doors or anything else, there is a reception now in the room next door. And just a big thanks to my colleagues, in particular, all my colleagues who've been involved in the preparation for this event, but in particular those colleagues in the communications department who sweated blood, I know, over this event, and I think it tells. So thank you to everybody, and see you for drinks shortly. Thank you.
Do you want to keep the rat going?